So I'm really happy to introduce both Paige Ulrey and Kathy Van Olst. Paige is a senior deputy prosecuting attorney at King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office with the Elder Abuse Project and Economic Crimes Unit with King County. She graduated with honors from Amherst College and earned her law degree at Northeastern University School of Law. And perhaps the most experienced and innovative elder abuse prosecutor in the country, she has handled cases of elder financial exploitation, neglect, physical assault, sexual assault, and homicide. Paige is a founder of the King County Elder Abuse Council and co-founder of King County Elder Abuse Multidisciplinary Team. She has presented internationally on the prosecution of elder abuse and contributed to a number of scholarly publications. She's deeply thoughtful in her approach to justice in cases of elder abuse, and her many areas of interest include how the theory of distributive justice can be applied to elder abuse prosecution and how geriatricians and prosecutors can collaborate to improve legal and health outcomes in elder abuse. And Kathy Van Olst is also a senior deputy prosecuting attorney at the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office in Seattle. Currently, she works as one of the elder abuse prosecutors handling elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation cases. Kathy has been a prosecutor with King County for more than 20 years, litigating cases and supervising trial attorneys. She serves on the King County Multidisciplinary Team. She also co-chairs the King County Elder Abuse Council. And Kathy has also served as the director for the King County Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention, managing the jail and community corrections systems for King County. So I think you can see you've got some incredible expertise today, sharing a focus on integrating knowledge of elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation into patient care. And we thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. We're really grateful to be here.
Absolutely. We're excited to talk to you today.
And we are hoping, Barb, that you can open the chat. If that's okay, just let people ask us questions.
Yep,
We've got a couple.
I've got this chat open and I'll be monitoring it.
Fantastic. And we got a couple of points in the presentation where we asked people for their feedback as well. So.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think you've got plenty of information about each of us. So I think we should just go ahead and launch our presentation. What we're going to do today is talk to you guys about a case that Kathy and I handled together for a number of years. And I don't know about you, Kathy, but I feel like it was kind of a career case for us.
I think it was one that certainly introduced me to a lot of the different issues that we're going to talk about today and how integrated healthcare issues are with the cases that we do.
That's right. And we're then going to talk about elder abuse generally, and then about sort of what you can do to help us make sure we do justice in these cases. Mm-hmm. And by doing justice, I don't just mean prosecuting these cases, because lots of times doing justice means not prosecuting them, but just help us by giving us your insight and perspective on the case that I think allows us to make better decisions on how we handle these cases. And finally, we'll conclude by talking about the King County Multidisciplinary Team that focuses on elder abuse. So our case example involves a man named Leonard S. And at the time Kathy and I got this case, Leonard was 66 years old. He was, as you can see in the photograph, he was an old 66. He was not super healthy. He had pretty significant developmental disabilities and physical disabilities. He was very small. And I met him once. Well, actually, I met him a number of times, but the first time I met him, I was shocked to see that he was missing the forefinger on each of his hands. So definitely some real struggles physically. And he was also very slow in his speech, and we'll talk more about that as we go here. Mm-hmm. But despite those issues that he had to deal with, he found a woman who he married, and she really was the love of his life. And they were together for over 30 years when this incident happened. They had three grown children. They owned their home. They had a mortgage on it, but they owned it. And Leonard had a full-time job working at an auto body shop. He was financially stable. They had life insurance, retirement benefits. But due to his disabilities, his wife handled all their finances. She kept track of their doctor's appointments and really kind of was the one who ran the household. And how, Kathy, please feel free to chime in if I forget anything.
I will. I
Okay.
will. I think it's really significant that they had 3 grown children, all of whom were independent, but still remained in contact with their parents and were involved in their lives to
All lived
very
in the
different
area.
degrees. Yeah,
Yeah.
all in the area.
So what happened was probably about 2.5 years before we got this case, Leonard's wife was killed in a car accident on her way to work. And Leonard was absolutely bereft. He really didn't know how to go on, but his children helped him kind of pick up the pieces. His daughter took over his finances. He went back to work and he forged ahead. But now, instead of going home after work like he used to, he started going to Classic Sports Bar in Renton after work and sort of getting his social needs met there. This is a picture of Classic Sports Bar. Several months later, while he was at the bar, a woman named Lisa ONeil came in and sat down at the table across from him. And as we understand it, she was also a regular customer of Classics, and she had been hearing Leonard talk about the fact that his wife had been killed, about the fact that he was expecting a pretty significant insurance settlement from the accident, the fact that they had CDs and other savings that he would be in charge of now that his wife was dead. So he definitely was talking a lot about his finances and especially about this insurance settlement that was coming his way as a result of the accident. She was 42 years old, so quite a bit younger than he was. He thought she was attractive. She had a long-term boyfriend he did not know about. She never mentioned her boyfriend initially to Leonard. And she was also in significant debt, and that was also something she did not talk about. The night that she sat down across from him at the bar, they hung out for a while. She bought him drinks, and then she asked Leonard to come over to her house afterwards. He did that. They continued drinking, and then she asked him to spend the night in the basement. That she had a bedroom down there. Her bedroom was upstairs, and she went upstairs and slept in her bedroom. He liked it there. She was very sweet to him. He was incredibly lonely, and they continued to see each other over the next couple of weeks. And essentially, she continued to pursue him. She would ask him to come over to lunch and dinner. She would make dinner for him, take him out, and really made him feel very special and taken care of. And after a couple of weeks, she asked him to move into her basement of her home. And Leonard, hopeful that he had met someone who he would be able to be with in the future, agreed. So he moved out of his house and moved into Lisa's house, into this bedroom in the basement. And this is a picture of Lisa's house. Pretty soon after Leonard moved into Lisa's house, Lisa started asking him for money. She first asked him if he would help pay off her $23,000 truck loan. She said she needed a new computer, and then she mentioned other debts. And Leonard, thinking that he was investing in their relationship, readily agreed. So he bought her this truck, paid off this truck loan, bought her a computer, paid off other debts, and really helped Lisa out significantly financially. And as I recall, Kathy, Lisa had a job. She was like a flagger or something, but I don't. She was. Yeah. It was not full-time work, as I recall.
It was not full-time work, and it was very transitional, and she also had asked Leonard to help keep up her home. Remember, and he had him do yard work downstairs, which was very difficult for him to do, and he would do it after his own work.
2 months after Leonard moved in, Lisa basically started telling him that his money would do a lot better at her bank. He'd been banking at Banner Bank and had been going to the same branch for decades along with his wife. And Lisa knew that. And so she wanted his money out of that bank. So she said to him, let's move it over to Bank of America. It'll do better there. And Leonard, really in her complete control, agreed. So one day, Leonard and Lisa drove over to Banner Bank in order to take his money out. And Leonard's daughter happened to see them there. During this whole time, she'd been trying to reach out to her dad, and he had really dropped off the radar, and she was having a lot of trouble calling him, visiting him. He was not available to her as soon as he moved into Lisa's house. So she was already extremely concerned at this point. And when she saw them together at the bank, she became very, very upset, and she called 911. An officer showed up at the bank, talked to Leonard, who said, no, everything's fine. As a result, the officer didn't take a report, just said this was civil. And he told Beverly, Leonard's daughter, that if she wanted to try to do something, she ought to hire a private attorney and see if she could file for guardianship. He did not notify Adult Protective Services. So basically the case died at that point. And this is just a picture of Banner Bank. So once Lisa had gained complete control over Leonard's money, the abuse began, and she started to isolate him even more, to make him work even harder on her property. She was actually trying to flip that house to resell it for a profit, and she was using him to improve the property, as Kathy said. And she started telling him that, your kids don't care about you, they just want your money. I'm the only person who really cares about you, and really convincing him that she was the only person in the world for him, and his family didn't love him. They just wanted to get at his assets. She started calling him names, and then eventually, as time went on, started to become physically abusive to him. Several months after Leonard moved in with Lisa, he suffered a stroke, and he was admitted to the hospital. And he was in there, I think, approximately a week or so.
Right.
And the result of the stroke was that his speech was even more impaired. His left arm was very weak, and we think his cognition was very likely even further impacted by the stroke. He actually moved back home, and his kids were taking care of him, and Lisa went over to, I think he started going back to work, and Lisa went to his garage, right, to the body shop where
to
he
the
worked.
employment.
Yep, and said, Leonard, come home with me. I'll take care of you. I'll take you to the doctor. You can be with me, and I'll make sure everything's taken care of. And so Leonard went back to her, and his kids were obviously extremely upset about this, but he was still hopeful that Lisa was going to be the one for him. And despite Lisa's promises, she did not follow up with his doctor's visits or his physical and speech therapy or his medication. So he basically went untreated for the months he was living with Lisa from this point on. And what we know is that she did give him meals, but she also was plying him with alcohol. So he was really not getting good care at this point, and was obviously extremely vulnerable after the stroke, and got no real follow-up care once he was in Lisa's home. Over the following 9 months, Lisa basically moved Leonard's accounts to a third bank. And we don't really know why. I think we were thinking it was probably because we felt that they were becoming suspicious. And so she went somewhere else with his money. He had CDs that he and his wife had purchased through their savings, totaling $90,000. She cashed those out and deposited them into her own account. He had life insurance policies. She cashed those out and deposited that money into her own accounts. And she stopped paying his mortgage on his house. She stopped paying his truck loan, and she stopped paying his cell phone bill. So she really was, at this point, isolating him completely and denying him everything he had had before. What we also know about the truck was that after she stopped paying the truck bill, she actually drove the truck back to the dealer and returned it. And Leonard had loved that truck. That was like his most important possession. And the house was also, we knew that there was a foreclosure looming on the house because he wasn't paying the mortgage. So really everything he owned was going into Lisa's hands at that point. And then about a year after Leonard moved in, Lisa got angry with him, shoved him down the stairs, and left him lying at the foot of the stairs. Leonard ended up fracturing a rib, but he didn't get medical treatment for it, but he was in a lot of pain. And at that point, he really came to terms with his situation and realized that Lisa was not going to be taking care of him, was not going to be marrying him. He also, I think at that point, had become aware of the fact, pretty soon after he moved in, actually, had become aware of the fact that she had this boyfriend. So he finally understood that this was not a place for him to be. And he packed up his remaining possessions in plastic bags and at 5:30 in the morning, slipped out the door and walked several miles to a friend's house and basically told her what had happened. And the whole story ended up coming to light for the first time.
As I remember, Paige, by this time he had stopped working for his long-term job, largely as a result of the stroke.
That's right.
And the friend's house that he walked to was his employer, his past employer, because she was somebody that understood him and he felt connected to.
That's right.
Okay.
And the other thing Lisa had done is moved his mailbox. Like he was getting mail at first at her house, and she had moved his mail to a PO box, and he wouldn't see it at her house. So she was going to the post office and picking up his mail, so he wouldn't have access to, the foreclosure notices and all the other notices he was getting about his unpaid bills.
Yeah, at least it started that soon afterwards too. Yeah.
And he didn't even have a cell phone. She'd taken away his cell phone and stopped paying his cell phone bill. So he was truly isolated and had no way of seeing his family members until he finally walked away. So once he went to his employer's house, she called his children. His children came over and talked to him, and slowly the whole story came out. And his daughter, Beverly, who really was his staunch advocate, called Adult Protective Services and called the police and said, you guys have to do something about what's happened to my dad. APS did respond. They interviewed Leonard. They felt that he was oriented ×3. They evaluated his ability to do his ADLs, and they found that he could do them without assistance. So they determined he was not a vulnerable adult, and they closed his case.
So Paige and I just wanted to stop at this point and get your reaction to this information, this story that we heard basically from APS and then eventually from Leonard and his family, as well as the police. And to think about, to ask you what your reactions are. When a case comes to us, we are looking at whether there's a criminal investigation. And in this case, should one be opened? Why or why not? And what are your thoughts? So there's
the chat box, but Karen has asked, why didn't the children alert authorities earlier?
Well, remember, Beverly did call 911, and she was told very clearly by law enforcement to hire a civil attorney. And she actually did call the civil attorney, and she explained to him what was going on. And he said, the amount of money it's going to cost you to file for guardianship is significant, and we really doubt that it will be successful. This is his free choice, essentially.
And it was mentioned that this is why things fall through the cracks, and it's very frustrating. Deborah has found it very difficult to get APS involved ever. She does think a case should be opened due to the social isolation, etc. And Cynthia said, even if he's not a vulnerable adult, that should not prevent a criminal investigation from being conducted. But the issue is, even when you call the police department, they can rationalize the behavior away.
Okay. I think we've all experienced that.
Yeah.
Sadly.
And Norma says, I've been a mandatory reporter for over 20 years and not once has APS found anything.
Wow.
No.
Okay. So we'll talk throughout the rest of our talk with you today. We'll sort of talk about some of those issues that you raised there, because we too have frustrations. We're hoping And one of the reasons that we have a multidisciplinary team that addresses elder abuse is for exactly the reasons you folks are articulating. That is an opportunity for us to work with other disciplines, with the police, with medical, with APS, and to work through difficult cases. And it's open for referral by medical and by law enforcement and APS. They're the one, you all bring us the cases to consult on. So hopefully that will be some inspiration to keep doing what you're doing. You're doing
Yeah,
all the
I feel
right
like
things.
we finally have, we've talked to healthcare providers many times in the past, and we just listen to your concerns, and we have a lot of the same concerns. But now we finally have a process that we're hoping might start making a difference. It's not obviously going to change APS, but it gives us a forum, all of us a forum to sort of push them into action in cases where we are challenging their conclusions.
So Liz says she's an APS investigator, and our statutes are clear that if the adult has capacity, then we do not have the authority to interfere. People are able to make poor decisions if they have decision-making capacity. But Chris had mentioned it seems predatory and strange that cognitive issues did not qualify Leonard as a vulnerable adult.
Well, I think that's right about the capacity, but I don't think someone necessarily has capacity just if they're oriented ×3. And, I think a lot of it depends on the kind of capacity screening that the APS investigator does. This case happened a number of years ago, and I think APS has done a really good job of improving their the screening that they do, but they're still not doing consistent screening with alleged victims. But we're going to talk a lot about Leonard's capacity, and we'll dive into that further.
Yeah.
So Karen says, so we can call you?
So yes, we're going to give you our contact information, so you can always call. We're welcome to take calls and to talk through cases, even if it's not a case in our jurisdiction. We're happy to help. So we're gonna move on now, having gotten your thoughts. Paige, you want to forward us?
Yes.
Since you are. So there was a police response after Beverly called again, and a criminal investigation was opened. The investigator in this case was someone who we had worked with before. I think Paige had worked with him on other investigations. He was not particularly familiar with elder abuse investigations, but the beauty of the way our practice handles cases is that we get involved from the very beginning with investigations and can help work with detectives to acquire the information that we need to determine whether or not it actually will be a case that would be prosecuted for elder financial exploitation in this case. So the detective did, as one of the first steps in his investigation, interviewed Leonard. And the detective made a number of important observations and learned a number of things from Leonard. He noted that when talking to Leonard, Leonard was slow to respond to some of the questions and took a bit more time to think through the questions and answer them. He also had impaired speech. Leonard was as well unable to recall some of the details from the time period in which he was living at Lisa ONeil's home. Leonard talked a bit about why he was no longer able to work at his full-time job as a result of the stroke. And one of his common comments that he made to the detective was that Lisa, quote, "She did everything so fast, I didn't have time to think." So again, another indicator that perhaps there's more going on here than you can see just at one blush. through the criminal investigation, the detective wanted to do more to try and figure out what was going on with regard to Leonard's understanding and his abilities. And so the detective, in working with us, was able to get a capacity evaluation of Leonard. As a result of that capacity evaluation, what the detective learned was that, in fact, Leonard was suffering from vascular dementia. That although he had, he scored fairly well on a mini mental status exam, that's the MMSE. He scored a 27 out of 30. On other testing revealed that he, in fact, had impaired executive function. So his particularly affecting his ability to handle his own financial affairs. And the evaluation concluded that he, in fact, lacked financial capacity and was likely the victim of undue influence as a result of Lisa ONeil's influence over him. So Paige and I wanted to stop at this point now that we've seen that there was, in fact, an evaluation that was a little bit more detailed than what the initial perhaps APS investigation revealed, and talk about cognitive capacity, particularly in light of our cases, and how that's so important.
And Kath, we got a couple questions here.
Oh, okay.
Do we know who paid for the evaluation, how the detective obtained the capacity evaluation, and who performed it?
So, yeah, I was going to say it was a geriatric regional assessment team, right?
Yeah, so GRAT, our wonderful GRAT, which was in full, totally working at that point. I'm sure you guys know about geriatric regional assessment team. And then they lost their funding, but they are coming back just recently. But they, at that time, were functioning and they were performing capacity evaluations at no cost. It was funded by King County, and a wonderful geriatric psychiatrist performed that evaluation. So we had the best possible evaluator, and we didn't have to pay for it, which was great. And then the testing, they also want to know, Patty wants to know what test was given for executive functioning. And I can't remember, but I think it was the slums, and we're going to talk more about that in a second.
And
I think it might.
Question: did the victim have to agree to the assessment?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And I think with GRAT and with a lot of the wonderful evaluators we have in our community, Dr. Rhodes is another person, Karan Taifour, those evaluators very rarely get refused on evaluation.
Chris Rhodes actually did a lecture for us a couple of weeks ago on driving. I guess it was last term. But I'm wondering if you have, so these attendees are from 6 different states.
Right.
Okay.
So King County has GRAT. Do you know of similar models in other states?
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to be King County centric. I don't think there are many GRATs in the country and in other parts of even Washington state. So what we recommend is for prosecutors and law enforcement to use the evaluators that APS is using, because our APS also uses GRAT or used to use GRAT. So that's, but unfortunately, it's not a common, that agency is not common.
We have developed relationships with different medical professionals, and that has been very helpful in trying to identify who might be appropriate evaluators in some of our cases. So there are, that I would say is the first step in trying to identify and find people to be able to step in to be able to do that work. But it is, I think that's absolutely right, that APS on occasion would get more detailed evaluations, and so we end up using some of the same people.
And that's sort of affirmed by someone in Alaska who says it can be really difficult to get the assessments completed. And I just wanted to mention that GRAT has been funded by a special levy that gets renewed every few years. And that's part of why funding has, even in King County, come and gone a little bit.
That's right, Barb.
Because it's a voter
Yes.
initiative.
Yes.
It is. And it used to be just public health that would fund that, but with budget cuts that was curtailed, and then the levy has picked it up since then. So.
And Kathy, there's one more question. Karen, I'm sorry, Gwen.
GRAT.
Oh, go ahead.
Somebody asked what GRAT stands for. I saw that one. Is Geriatric Regional Assessment Team.
And they go into the home and conduct capacity screening tests and interviews in the home to determine what mental health needs the elder has.
Now it's a little more complicated. They have tried to do similar evaluations over the phone, which is, you might imagine, is variable as far as the success. But there are other evaluators that are still going into the home and doing cognitive evaluations in the home. So it takes some hunting, but they are there. They're around.
And then Kathy, Gwen wanted to know if the capacity evaluation applies retroactively. So I can tell you that in this case, I asked the evaluator if she could give us an opinion on Leonard's capacity, over the past year and 2 years, really. And she was able to talk about his developmental disability as having been a long-term, lifelong thing for Leonard. So she was able to give us some idea of his capacity at the time that he met Lisa and throughout that time. But that's always something we need. And so we need to get, whenever we get an evaluation done, we're getting the medical records and any of the other evidence we can to give the evaluator, because our hope is that they can give us an idea of what was going on, not only at the present, but during the time when the crime occurred.
And in Leonard's case, that was particularly important too, because he had suffered a stroke. And so those medical records that we were able to get and provide to the evaluator were helpful for her with regard to what type of stroke and the impact that may have caused as well. I think too, Leonard's situation was also compounded by the grief and the loneliness. And so she was able to speak toward those things as well, both, and that would have been retroactive as well. So should we?
Yeah, there's one other question, just really quick. Karen wanted to know if a person is cognitively intact, but a victim of overt abuse, can anything be done? And as I think Liz had said from APS before, if you have capacity and you don't want APS intervention or you don't want law enforcement intervention, it may be that you can refuse that. It sort of depends on, if your life is in danger or not. But if it's financial exploitation alone and you refuse to do anything about it, it's very likely that everyone is going to say, okay, as long as you have capacity and you're not the victim of undue influence, then you can agree to give your money to anyone you want. But if it's physical abuse or anything that's like sexual abuse or neglect, I think law enforcement is likely to intervene. Yeah, if you're physically threatened.
Yeah. So talking just a little bit about the cognitive capacity, it sounds like from the questions we've gotten that many of you are familiar with that term. It is sort of a clinical term, and it's really just about that refers to an assessment of a person's mental abilities. And as we all know, and what we have learned in our cases is that that capacity is really focused on activity. And so what we learned from Leonard was certainly he has the capacity to do a number of different things. Paige, for some reason, that thing went backwards, but he could undertake a number of different activities, and in fact, could have the capacity to do and perform his ADLs quite proficiently, and yet did not have financial capacity in order to handle his own finances, and was susceptible to undue influence by Lisa ONeil. So the loss of financial capacity, as many of you probably know, is extremely common, especially with early dementia. And that from that loss of capacity, we often find that there are additional areas of capacities that are lost over time.
Is this me, Kathy?
I think it is.
Okay.
Okay.
So the reason we as prosecutors care about capacity is because in elder financial cases, the most common defense that gets raised is consent. And it comes up in the form of the perpetrator saying, I was the only one who took care of her. She wanted me to have all of her money. The money was a loan. I was going to pay him back. His children were out to get him. He wanted me to have everything. And those things may be true. But that's part of what our investigation looks into. But what also may be true is that the elder may lack capacity to consent to hand over their finances or their assets. So we really can't figure out if someone truly consented to doing something like this in the way that Leonard truly consent to give Lisa all of his assets, unless we find out whether they had capacity to consent. So in almost every one of our cases, we routinely ask for medical records, capacity screening tests, capacity evaluations in order to figure out, did the victim have capacity at the time this incident occurred? And we also often need it for sexual abuse cases where there's a consent defense, and neglect cases where the perpetrator claims that the victim was refusing medical care. So it really comes up very frequently in our cases. Some screening tests that we mentioned, the MSE, which is a very common screening test, but is known not to really pick up on executive function impairment. And MSEs have been, I'm sure you guys are way more familiar with them than Kathy and I are, but what we have found routinely is that a lot of times, like primary care providers or APS or other people in the field will administer the MSE, and people will score pretty well on it. But when they end up getting a full-blown capacity evaluation, it turns out they actually have significant impairment, but it was missed by the MSE because it's only assessing for memory loss. Some other screening tests that end up usually being much better, from what I understand, at picking up executive function impairment or frontal lobe impairment are the SLUMS, the St. Louis University Mental Status Exam. And I think that was given to Leonard actually by GRAT. The MoCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, is also much better at revealing cognitive impairment of the frontal lobe. There's a test called the SPACED. There's another one we didn't put on here, but we should, called the IDA, that was developed at Cornell Medical School and was specifically designed for adult protective services investigators in the field. There's a frontal assessment battery. So all of those are apparently much better at picking up executive function impairment. And with the MMSE, the result of it basically focusing on memory loss alone is that a lot of cases of early dementia are missed. Because as Kathy pointed out earlier, there are a lot of people with early dementia whose memory is intact, but their judgment is significantly impaired. And it's a very common thing that we see in our cases. Is this me? So
it is you, but I'm happy. These are some of the notes that Leonard wrote, right, Paige? When he was about his time with Lisa.
So it's right after he left Lisa's, he gave this note, he was trying to remember everything that happened, and he gave this note to the detective.
Yeah, the detective had asked him to sort of think through what he could remember, what he could remember of that experience, and to identify what kinds of things were most significant to him about Lisa, the way Lisa treated him.
And these were some of the things Lisa called him: leprechaun, moron, and faggot. He remembered that very clearly.
And then threats.
Yeah, threats to push him down the stairs. But you can see even from his handwriting that he's got some significant impairment, I think. So this, I think this is
Yeah,
you.
I think that, yeah, I'll grab it.
Sorry,
So
there's
a year
no
and a
numbers.
half, I know, a year and a half after the detective started sort of the investigation in this case, we filed charges based on the capacity eval that we had gotten and based on all of the information the detective had put together by interviewing both Leonard, but also Leonard's former employer, as well as Leonard's children who were cooperating with us too. And we filed criminal charges. We filed theft in the first degree. That's the highest level theft you can file in Washington State. And it basically says that the theft was a taking of more than $5,000. In Washington State, you can aggregate many small takings into if they reach to reach that $5,000 level. And here there wasn't much. There were some larger takings because Lisa ONeil was liquidating some of the CDs and just transferring that money straight to her own accounts. That theft was also filed with a vulnerable victim aggravator, which allows us to ask for a higher sentence if we are able to show that the victim was vulnerable at the time. And as a side note, a vulnerable victim under Washington criminal law is not the same as a vulnerable victim under APS definition of vulnerable victims. And so so it's a much easier standard, and so that was part and parcel of our charges against Lisa ONeil, as well as we filed one count of assault in the 4th degree so that we could talk about the domestic violence aspect of the relationship between Leonard and Lisa ONeil. And then later, when it got close to trial, what we did is we split up the thefts into additional charges of theft, which we were able to prove up at trial.
And just to point out, we don't need a victim to be vulnerable in order to file criminal charges in a case like this. That was an aggravator, but the standard theft statute applies here. So even if Leonard hadn't been vulnerable, we would have been able to file charges here.
So then this case was not one that that Lisa ONeil wanted to take to take responsibility with regard to her behavior. And so we actually, Paige and I went to trial on this case with a jury. And in our case, we called Leonard as a witness in our case, as well as Leonard's children. Beverly was a really good witness because she was the daughter, Leonard's daughter, and remembered a lot of the detail that Leonard might have forgot at times. And so that was very helpful to us. We called the detective. We called bank personnel. Again, this is some of the banking people at Banner Bank were so connected to Leonard and his wife that they were able to testify about Leonard's wife being the primary financial person for the family and how they saw her being able to handle those finances, whereas Leonard was not as equipped to be able to do that even before the death of his wife. So they were fabulous for us as well. And we also had a financial analyst, which our office has, because we work in economic crimes, has a financial analyst. And so she also reviewed all of the bank records for us and was able to testify about all of the different transfers. And when you heard about Lisa ONeil moving money from bank to bank, she was able to show how that happened and in what ways that happened. With regard to our the GRAT evaluation, the geriatric psychiatrist that did that evaluation, we called her at trial as well, and she testified regarding the diagnosis, her diagnosis of Leonard as suffering from vascular dementia. She also testified about his score on the mini mental status exam. With regard, she testified about his impaired executive functioning, and then her conclusions with regard to his susceptibility to undue influence as a result of his impairment.
And Kathy, we've got a couple other chat comments. Do you want
Okay.
those now?
Sure.
Okay. Cynthia pointed out, and I think she's a little more knowledgeable about the MMSE than we are. But she says the MMSE assesses more than memory loss. It includes orientation, language, visual spatial skills, and attention. It may not be as good as the others you recommend, but it isn't just memory, and that's important to know. So thank you, Cynthia. I think we tend to oversimplify it in our black and white world, and I appreciate that comment.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would just say that I think Cynthia's absolutely right. I had one case that I tried, and it involved again an elderly gentleman, but he was an artist, and so while on the spatial and the activities of the MMSE that required him to do drawings and clock drawing, which is a sort of a familiar one on the MMSE, he was perfect. He did it perfectly, and yet he scored very poorly on the MMSE because of his lack of capacity in other areas. So it is, she's absolutely right that it does test other qualities and other capacities as well.
The other thing I learned from Dr. Rhodes is that the MMSE is not as good at picking up cognitive impairment with people of color. And also that it is not good at picking up MCI, mild cognitive impairment. So those are some other things that I just learned from him. And then there was another comment that Sarah says, I'm struggling with the idea of screening for capacity. It seems that capacity to make decisions with a medical provider would be different than someone's capacity to make decisions with their abuser, given all the manipulation. So I think that's, Kathy, I don't know if you want to talk, Kathy, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think this is, you might do much better. You might be much more functional. You would be much more functional if someone's just testing you in an office versus in an abusive situation where you're under so much stress. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think that was one of the reasons that we wanted to add the charge of an assault on the domestic violence aspects of it. And so I think that was another way to sort of try and get at some of the other environmental dynamics that could have really influenced Leonard's ability to handle the situation differently. So.
And I don't know why the MSE is not as good at picking up cognitive impairment with people of color, but that is what Dr. Rhodes said. And my guess is it's probably, been tested, and it was probably not tested on a very diverse population.
So I'm wondering if I can try something else. We've had an attendee who's put her hand up several times.
Okay.
And it may be that she can't see the chat box. So I'm going to try and see if I can allow Martha Cover-Killen to talk. If you're able to pose your question.
Sorry, that was an accident. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Good. All right.
Thanks.
All right. Well, so then I'm going to flip over and talk a little bit about the defense case. And the defense in this case was put on by Ms. ONeil's defense attorney, who called her family and friends to testify more or less about her good character. Also that Leonard always wanted Lisa ONeil to have his money, was one of the things that they testified to. They testified that Leonard was an alcoholic, and so talked about his drinking as a contributor to excuse the behavior by Lisa ONeil. they also talked about that Lisa ONeil was just saving Leonard from his children who were exploitive and simply wanted Leonard around them for his money, so they could use his money. Defense also put on the APS worker who had done the initial screening of Leonard and then closed the case. I'll you know, in having the Adult Protective Service worker testify for the defense, well, they were able to get in some of the observations from the APS worker and the findings with regard to the MMSC that they had done. There was a lot of detail about Leonard's life and what Leonard was able to tell the APS worker that we were also able to use. So it, as Paige and I have often found in some of our cases that are the close ones always go to trial. You know, sometimes the APS worker is called by us and sometimes they're called by defense. And it's just the way it goes. There's always good information that they have from their investigations. The defense also put on the patrol officer who had responded to the Benner Bank when Beverly had called the first time, and who had said that the case was just civil in nature, as a way to try and influence the jury in their reflection on the case and whether it was criminal or civil. But luckily, Paige and I prevailed and ended up, the jury found Lisa ONeil guilty of 14 counts of theft in the first degree. They also found the vulnerable victim aggravator on each of those counts, so that we were able to ask the court for additional time with regard to a penalty on sentencing. And interestingly enough, they found Lisa ONeil not guilty on the misdemeanor assault charge that we had filed. But through the course of the trial, we were able to get in the sort of domestic violence nature of the whole relationship between these two. So we weren't surprised, and we weren't upset by that, their ultimate verdict on that. So
and his
Paige,
sentence is missing on here.
Yeah. So we didn't. So the sentence, Lisa ONeil was sentenced by the judge and received 62 months in prison. She was to have the court ordered that she was to have no contact with Leonard for 10 years. And she was ordered to pay $55,000 in restitution. I think that's right, Paige.
And sentenced to?
Community custody as well.
Right. And sadly, we learned that Lisa died about,
Yeah.
I think about 2
She
years into her sentence.
Yeah. So she was ultimately 2 years after she was sent to prison, she was released on an emergency medical leave and then died. So.
And Chris wanted to know if the restitution covered the losses, Kathy.
You know, it didn't cover all of the losses, certainly. In order to have the losses ordered by the court to be repaid, all of them have to be proved up separately for the court to order that. And so we were able to prove up a little over $55,000 in loss.
So even though that restitution was ordered to be paid by Lisa, you know, my guess is Leonard got a couple of $1,000s before Lisa died. And we don't have any system in our, we don't have any funding in our system to repay Leonard for what he lost. So he will never get most of the money that was taken from him.
So that was our case discussion. And it is, so now what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about elder abuse itself and some of the aspects of elder abuse that we have learned of in the course of prosecuting these cases, and learned about the research surrounding elder abuse. So elder abuse is defined, and Paige, if you want to just click through these.
Sure.
This is one definition of elder abuse. This was a definition that comes from the Elder Justice Roadmap that was done in July of 2014. That was a conglomeration of experts talking about elder abuse, researchers. It was convened in order to try and establish some common definitions and some common themes, and a roadmap on how to address elder abuse. And so the definition there is the psychological, sexual, or physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, as well as neglect, abandonment, financial exploitation of an older person that occurs in any setting in a relationship where there's an expectation of trust, and or when an older person is targeted based on age or disability. In Washington State, we have a number of different crimes that we will charge as elder abuse. We have anything in the physical abuse realm that is assault or unlawful imprisonment. Kidnapping would be another one. With regard to neglect, we have caregiver neglect, which we call the crime in Washington State is termed criminal mistreatment or abandonment. As well, we have financial exploitation of elders, which includes theft, identity theft, forgery, those kinds of economic crimes. We charge sexual assault, sexual abuse cases that range from rape to indecent liberties. And we also charge sort of what we call psychological abuse, so stalking, harassment, those sorts of crimes as well. And, as we split them all these different crimes out into these different categories of crimes, the important issue to remember is that these are often co-occurring. And the different types of abuse, such as what we have found, caregiver neglect kinds of cases, dovetail often with financial exploitation. And so financial exploitation is often a common theme in almost every one of the other types of cases. Some general facts about elder abuse is that for every one case that is reported, there are nearly 23 that never come to light. These statistics come from a New York study, prevalence study that was done back in 2011. As well, for every one case of elder financial exploitation that's reported, there are nearly 43 cases that never come to light.
And these are just some reasons why a lot of victims are reluctant to report. A lot of times victims are in a relationship with the perpetrator, so there's a price that they pay for reporting. A lot of people feel shame at having been exploited and stupid. A lot of victims we work with say, I was just so stupid, which is really heartbreaking. A lot of people are afraid of retaliation by the perpetrator, afraid of losing their independence, afraid that if they report, it might mean that they've got dementia and that they are can't be out living on their own. They need to go into a facility. It's a lot of people's fear. And a lot of people get invested into, once they're locked into some kind of scam, they're afraid that if they report, there's no hope of getting their money back. And then we also see many victims who have dementia and they simply don't recognize that they're being exploited. And what we know from the studies is that almost half of people with dementia experience some form of elder abuse. So we want to talk a little bit about the concerns faced by you all. oh wait, Patty made a really great point that people often don't trust the justice system. And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, anyone who's
Yeah.
seen as like a state actor, APS, law enforcement, prosecutors, people for many good reasons, given their histories, very often don't trust us, and they don't want to be coming to us when something like this happens. I'm going to actually add that bullet. Thank you, Patty. That needs to be in there. But as far as concerns faced by you all in talking to healthcare providers, these are just some of the things that we've heard. You know, it's a really, I think a lot of healthcare providers feel like it's a very aggressive thing to report on a patient who, especially if that patient doesn't want them to report on them. And they also worry about what will happen after the report is made. They also legitimately feel a little bit cynical that, you know, if they report, nothing's going to change, and then this victim could be in even more danger of losing their money or of being abused. And sometimes also people believe that the abuser is doing the best they can. You know, they may not feel it's abuse. They may feel that it's just ignorance or lack of education or resources, which it may be. So there's a lot of complexities that I think healthcare providers face when they're thinking about reporting these cases. But what we want to remind you guys is that even though we recognize that our system of response is imperfect, that we are working on it, and we are all getting better at what we do. APS has developed a financial exploitation unit. They have a lot more expertise than they used to have. We now have 2.5 full-time prosecutors versus the one that we used to have 20 years ago. We have more dedicated law enforcement officer or detectives, and just generally more education. So things are getting better in not just in King County, but across the country and across Washington State. And just remember that what you see as a healthcare provider may only be a tiny sliver of what's actually happening. So it actually could be much worse than what you're seeing. Usually, if there is no intervention, these things are not going to go away. And I think that's really important to remember. The trend of most forms of abuse is that they get worse and worse the longer they occur. And just a reminder to you all that your job, even if you know, well, if you do a report and if you don't, whichever, your job is not to fix the problem, but just to relay your concerns to those who can intervene and offer services. So it's just really important to remember that it's not on you to try to fix a situation, just to report it and let APS and law enforcement and prosecutors do their jobs and figure out whether this is something that should be responded to. And this is just another study that I think is very telling, which says that any form of abuse, including financial exploitation, increases premature death in the elderly by 300%. So it is really, it can't be emphasized enough how important it is for all of us to be responding to these cases.
Paige, a question came in the Q&A box, and they're asking here in Seattle, King County, at what phase do cases get to the GRAT?
So GRAT can be called by you all, by APS, by anyone at any time. I mean, as far as we're concerned, the sooner the better. If someone's potentially being exploited, figuring out if they have dementia is a really important part of figuring out how to respond, because you do have the right to give your money to anyone. So if an elder is saying, look, you know, this person's my caregiver, yeah, it's not my kid, but I want them to have my money, and they have capacity, they have the right to give their money to that person.
Yeah.
But if they don't have capacity, it looks very different. So it's, I think, getting that capacity assessment or screening at least done early on is super important.
Yeah, you can do it. There was a question about a power of attorney, and we are going to get there. So that's a little bit further on in our discussion, but we will talk about powers of attorney and elder financial exploitation.
And Kathy, one more quick comment. Cynthia just said that sometimes reporters believe they have the right to know the results of an APS investigation and mistakenly conclude that because they didn't hear back, nothing was done. That's a really important point. I think a law was passed that says now that the reporter, if they call and ask, that APS will inform them of the outcome of the investigation. Is that right, Kathy?
You know, I have heard that, but I have not seen that is true. I mean, I haven't seen the law that change. So, but I think that APS, at least in our region, is getting a little bit better about that. So that they will tell reporters if there's been a result.
they may well be, as Cynthia said, offering services and responding, and you may, as a reporter, may not even be told that that's what's happening. So,
Yeah.
don't assume nothing is happening just because you don't hear back about what they did.
Yeah.
Okay, Kathy.
So we're going to talk a little bit now about recognizing elder abuse and what we would call, sort of signs, symptoms, those kinds of issues as we go through the different types of elder abuse. But to start off, we talk about what are the typical perpetrators that we have in our cases. And I think nationally, we also see these same individuals, perpetrators, as presenting in the elder abuse cases. One is family members. We have a lot of family members who are in the perpetrators in our elder abuse cases. A lot of these cases, I will say, are financial exploitation cases, but we also find it in both the assault and sexual assault areas.
And neglect.
And neglect. You're absolutely right. Sorry, Paige.
Okay.
And as well, caregivers, again, both paid professional caregivers as well as informal caregivers. Paige and I have had a number of cases in which we've prosecuted involving caregivers. And I will say a word of warning that, Craigslist is often a vehicle that people employ to try and find caregivers. And that's a worrisome sign because sometimes that does not work out well. We have had a number of cases result from from caregivers found on Craigslist. Trusted others, that can be powers of attorney, can be perpetrators as well as investment advisors, neighbors, handymen that come to a home and offer their help. It can be a guardian, it can be someone from a faith community that is also involved. And we've had, as well as folks are more and more, I think, aware of, that a common perpetrator is involved in scams. It can be either a local scam, a national scam, and even an international scam. And we're seeing those, especially there's been a lot more education around scams just because of the COVID and some of the scams that have come about as a result of taking advantage of people in COVID. Some of the biggest risk factors, both in research as well as what Paige and I have found, are social isolation, loneliness experienced by the victims, as well as dementia. And that can often be mild cognitive impairment or just the beginning of dementia for individuals.
So we're going to talk about signs and symptoms. We only have a little over 15 minutes left, but just the various forms of abuse. So with regard to neglect, we just want you guys to be aware of this, and I'm sure you know this better than we do, but these are just some different signs that we see of possible neglect. And obviously these things on their own have a lot of medical explanations and may not mean anything, but oftentimes if you see a cluster of these signs, it may be something that is more about neglect versus some underlying conditions. So just being aware of those things. And we do prosecute these cases. And usually it's only the very severe ones that rise the level of being criminal, but they are prosecutable, and sometimes prosecution is appropriate. Not always, but sometimes. Self-neglect is the same thing as obviously as neglect, minus the fact that there's a caregiver involved. Self-neglect is obviously not criminal. And these are just some things that often can cause neglect to rise to the level of being criminal. As I said, when there's multiple signs of serious neglect, usually advanced, untreated, or improperly treated pressure sores on unlikely locations like the front of the body. We've seen a number of those cases. Poor hygiene and malnutrition and dehydration. Usually all of those signs are common in the kinds of cases that become criminal. And the other thing that's really important about a case in sort of for us in determining whether or not it should be charged is where the caregiver has assumed the duty of care. Obviously, they are responsible for the vulnerable adult, and they're benefiting financially from failing to obtain proper care. So it's not someone who's a son who is, DD and living with a parent who suddenly is forced to take care of the parent. It's not someone who is also elderly and is suddenly in a position of taking care of their spouse. It's somebody who is actively choosing to keep the elder in the home with inadequate care in order to continue either living off of their income or to inherit from them when they die. Lorraine made a comment that the sad thing I've seen is everyone loves grandma until they have to spend grandma's money on grandma. And I've seen the worst and the best care from families. And that's a really good point. And there are a lot of family members who choose money over the proper care of the elder and their family. And oftentimes we see gambling or drug or alcohol addictions going hand in hand with those perpetrators' actions or inaction.
Mm-hmm. The next is physical and sexual abuse, and many of these identifiers or signs or symptoms are things that you would be familiar with in your own practices. So here is a elder bruising study that really talks about bruising with elders, and where accidental bruises are more likely to be located versus bruising that is more likely to be inflicted bruises. So it's an important study that was done in 2009, and so for us, some of the important takeaways are that bruising that cannot be staged. We used to always think that you could stage it based on color. You can't really do that. And this study shows that, as well as the fact that accidental bruises rarely occur on the neck, ears, genitalia, or the soles. Paige, people who are abused are more likely to remember the cause of their bruises. This is the case that the study found, as well as that applies even though someone may have dementia or the beginnings of dementia, and they can accurately report how they were bruised. And so it was an important finding and an important lesson for us to remember when working with victims who may have dementia. This is just identification of the areas that are more concerning for bruises as a result of abuse. So it's just a rearticulation in a picture format. Then other red flags for elder physical abuse. I'm sure these are also things that that arise in many different contexts, but pattern bruising or lacerations, burns. The caregiver sometimes will appear to be be a controlling person and be the one that wants to speak for the victim, sometimes perhaps in a medical visit. And if you see someone with various ages of healing injuries, that is also concerning for elder physical abuse. Sexual abuse as well. I'm sure you are very familiar with these sorts of signs of sexual abuse, but the same thing applies when you're working with elder patients, that any kind of pain or bleeding in the genital areas or mouth, bruising in certain locations, the outer arms or the abdomen, pelvis, inner thighs or areas, bite marks, unexplained STDs or HIV, and sort of the observation that you might be able to make about some sort of inappropriate relationship between the adult and the abuser. I think what's so important when we're going through these signs and symptoms is that one by themselves is not necessarily determinative of something, but it's a confluence of a number of different factors that you might see.
So with regard to financial exploitation, someone asked about power of attorney, and that is a really common method that we see of elder financial exploitation being committed. And we call that abuse of a fiduciary relationship. So a power of attorney, someone who's power of attorney for someone else or guardian for someone else has a fiduciary duty to act in their financial best interests. So what we always tell law enforcement is that if you've got someone who's power of attorney who seems to be spending the elder's money, they're typically not allowed to do that. There may be a gifting provision in the power of attorney document that authorizes them to spend, for instance, up to what the federal gifting tax provision allows, which is $15,000 a year. But even that is unusual. Usually there's no gifting provision, which means they can't gift themselves anything. That's the most typical form of power of attorney that we see. So and what we also know is that law enforcement oftentimes misses those cases and thinks that abuse of power of attorney is a civil matter, not a criminal matter. But in fact, they are criminal matters. It's actually much easier for us to prove financial exploitation where there's a power of attorney because that fiduciary relationship exists. So those cases it's really important to report those concerns to law enforcement. Undue influence is another form of elder financial exploitation, which we saw in Leonard's case, where the perpetrator really gains not just physical control of the victim, but emotional control over them. So that's that, and they do that in order to obtain their consent to turn over their assets. So as I said, abuse of power of attorney and abuse of guardianship are theft. They are criminal. And this is just a definition of undue influence. It's a pattern of behavior that's manipulative, similar to grooming. Often victims are vulnerable in some way, done in order to obtain their consent to turn over their assets. And these cases are also potentially criminal. And these are just some red flags of financial exploitation. I won't go over them here because we're running out of time, but any of these things that you might see are certainly things for you to take note of. Even though this isn't something about the physical health of your patient, it's certainly something that is important to their well-being. And one report from you could really prevent tremendous losses on their part.
So we were going to have a little discussion, and so we'll sort of talk about what the follow-up to this discussion was going to be. But what are some of the opportunities for intervention in Leonard's case? I think it gets us all thinking about how we might do that. In this case, in Leonard's case, it clearly were the bank tellers. As money was moving, it was an opportunity for better intervention and to stop some of the losses. The patrol officer when 911 was called, APS. But I think most importantly, there were some opportunities too that we could look to for healthcare providers. And when Leonard failed to show up for appointments or failed to follow through on either the medications or the therapies that were suggested, all of those could have been opportunities for intervention and perhaps stopped the loss for Leonard.
So we're just going to talk briefly about how you all as healthcare providers are really in a unique position to respond to elder abuse. So often, as we've said, these victims are isolated, and you may be the only person outside of their family or their caregiver to see them. I think people trust their healthcare providers in the way they don't trust many others, and so they're more likely to talk to you. And they're also used to direct answers to questions about sensitive topics. So people are, I think, much more comfortable talking about these difficult subjects with you than they would be with law enforcement or prosecutors. So just some things that you guys can do is just to consider the possibility that abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation may be occurring. And when you see these signs that we've talked about, to ask yourself if it's possible that abuse, neglect, or exploitation might be an explanation for the signs and symptoms that you're seeing. And document. This may be that nothing comes of this case at this point, but we will, as Kathy and I said, always be looking at all the healthcare records we can get on any victim. So we're going to be looking back sometimes for years to see what was documented. And so all your documentation is absolutely crucial to our cases, especially any signs of neglect and injuries or cognitive impairment. And then any statements the patient makes to you or the caregiver makes to you are also very, very important. And concerns about behavior by either the patient or their caregiver, again, it's really, really important to our cases. And then assessing any testing you conduct will be vitally important to a criminal case. Again, we've talked about the MMSE. Milk and slums are preferred, but MMSE is certainly also helpful, and anything you can do to do any kind of screening will be important to our cases. And then referring for a full-blown capacity evaluation, if that's possible to do.
Yeah. And when you talk about reporting, it's either to law enforcement, if you actually see something that is concerning that you believe might be a crime, and to DSHS. We've put down numbers that are 800 numbers, at least for Washington State. And then with regard to mandatory reporting, I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of licensed professionals are mandatory reporters of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Again, you don't have to be right. You don't have to be certain, but calling people in order to try and get some intervention to determine whether there is something going on is vitally important. And even this is just a reminder that HIPAA does not prevent mandatory reporting of elder abuse and domestic violence. Coordination of care in these cases is essential, and it is all the way from medical intervention as well through law enforcement and then to the prosecution of a case. It may prevent elder abuse and exploitation, and it can stop some existing exploitation as well.
So we're just going to take the last couple of minutes to talk about the King County Elder Abuse MDT, as we call it. And this was also funded, like GRAT, by the Veterans and Human Services Levy. And it brings together professionals from different systems to problem solve complex cases of elder abuse. And the idea is for those cases where you're seeing repeat signs of abuse or neglect or exploitation, and you've called and nothing has happened, we are happy to field those calls. And what we will do then is we have a full-time paid coordinator. We'll give you his contact information at the end, but you report, he will then contact APS and see what's happened. And it may well be, as we've said, that APS has already taken action and you just didn't know it. But if not, if APS has screened the case out or has felt that there was nothing more they could do, it might be a proper case for staffing. So please don't hesitate in King County to reach out to us so we can look into it. Our team is comprised of these agencies. So it's really a robust team. We have a geriatrician and her fellows from Swedish Geriatric, as well as all these other professionals. And we also have a financial analyst. We meet every 2 weeks. And we work collaboratively to address these specific cases and figure out the best path forward for the patient. Kathy, anything you want to add there?
No, not really. I think this is King County's response. I know there's lots of people that are on from different jurisdictions, but it's clearly these slides are things that you can look to see if there's something similar in your jurisdiction and can work on that. So the types of cases, this is just a criteria of cases that we review and look at, and contact information for here in King County. And the actual medical professional does participate in the MDT case discussion and provides important information to us.
And if you are the referent to the case, we ask you to, be in the meeting. Our meetings are all on Zoom at this point, and we would ask you to participate in the meeting, and we'd bring together the detective if there is one on the case, the APS investigator if there is one, any other professionals who are working on the case, so that we can all talk together about all the information that exists and together figure out the best path forward on the case.
And I think this is our contact information. So we're happy to speak with you today and to engage in a dialogue about elder abuse, exploitation, and neglect, and just the importance of the topic.
Barb, do we have time for any?
Yeah, I've just put it in. We did get a question coming into the Q&A. So back to when you were talking about bruises, Dan was asking if bruises can be staged by color, as in severity, or a rough estimate of when it occurred. Do you have a sense of that?
We just know from Dr. Mosqueda's study that color, they specifically studied the question of whether color can determine age of bruising, and they found that it cannot.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think the geriatrician on your MDT has also spoken to this group a couple of times.
Oh, Dr.
per-
Rubenstein?
Yes.
Oh,
Terry
that's great.
Rubenstein,
That's
good.
great. That's
Yep.
excellent. Well, Kathy and I are also here. If any of you all have questions or you are not getting a proper response from law enforcement in King County, we're happy to follow up with them as well. So we just, you guys are just crucial to our
Work,
successful
yeah.
handling of these cases and our work. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be ever the educator and sort of say, this is a wonderful opportunity hearing about grad here in King County, about getting involved in policy to get something similar in your areas, because it has largely been funded most recently through this levy that voters vote on each.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. This was just really excellent. Thanks so much, Kathy and Paige. A lot of comments about the great work that you do, and thanks for all of that. Very informative. Really sorry to hear about Leonard, and
I know.
but thanks for taking on that case and actually seeing it through to an appropriate decision, jury decision.
Yep.
Thanks so much for having
Thanks.
us.
Thanks for having us and being able to talk. And even if you're from outside our jurisdiction, feel free to call if you have questions. It is remarkable. Paige and I do teach all across on a national prosecutor conference. And so we may have somebody in your jurisdiction that could help you.
Oh, great. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely.
and
Thank you.
we will see all of the rest of you next week on our talk on anemia. Very different topic, but nonetheless important. And Paige and Kathy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting
Take
us.
care.